There is a thing about a town that nobody writes down in the county records. It is this, that a town will laugh at a man long before it will look at him, and it will look at him long before it will need him, and it will need him long before it will ever, in its whole stubborn life, say thank you. I have lived 71 years on the cold side of a mountain, and I have watched all four of those things happen to one man in the space of a single winter. I kept the ledger of it. I keep the ledger of everything, that being my one sad gift. And if you sit with me a while, I will read you the part of that ledger that I never showed the assessor, because it does not have numbers in it. It has the night the snow came down like the sky had given up, and the only square of warm light for 11 miles was burning inside a house that we had all, every one of us, called a joke. The wind started talking around 3 in the afternoon, and by dark it was screaming. I remember because I was counting nails. That is a thing I do. When my hands are cold and my chest is tight and the worry has gotten up into the back of my throat where I cannot swallow it down, I take the coffee tin off the shelf and I pour the nails into my palm and I count them. And somewhere around 40, I usually stop feeling like the world is coming apart. My wife, when she was living, used to watch me do it and shake her head and say, "Eli, you are the only man in the territory who soothes himself with hardware." I did not have a better answer for her then, and I do not have one now. A man takes his comfort where he can find it, and I found mine in a coffee tin of bent and salvaged iron, which, looking back, was the first sign that I should have understood Nate long before I did. But I get ahead of myself. Let me start the way it actually started, which was 3 winters earlier, on a bright dry morning with no snow in it at all, when the wagon first came up the wash road carrying a load of scrap iron and a man nobody knew. We called the valley Dry Fork, on account of the creek that ran through it 9 months of the year and lied about it the other 3. There were maybe 30 families spread across it, ranching mostly, a few who tried farming and gave it up, and the town itself was one street, one church that doubled as a school, a store run by a Dutchman named Volker who would cheat you with a smile so warm you'd thank him for it, and a saloon that had no name because nobody had ever needed to tell anybody else where it was. We were not a generous place. I want to be honest about that since I am the one telling it. High desert makes hard people. The ground gives you nothing without a fight, and after a while you start treating everything that way, including each other, including strangers, including, God help us, a quiet man who only wanted a corner of nobody's land to build a house on. He bought the corner fair. That much even his enemies never argued. It was a worthless half-acre against the North Rocks that flooded in spring and baked in summer, owned by the bank because the family who'd had it before had starved off it, and the bank was glad to be rid of it for $19. Nate paid in coin, counted it out slow on Volker's counter, and Volker took it and then, the second the man was out the door, told the whole store that an Apache had just bought the flood corner, and what did we think he was going to grow up there, arrowheads? The store laughed. I will tell you that I laughed too, because I am not in the business of making myself out better than I was. I laughed, and I went home, and I thought no more about it for about a week. Then the noise started. You could hear it from the church, which meant you could hear it from most of the valley if the wind sat right. A slow, patient hammering, iron on iron, ringing out across the rocks from before sunup to after dark. Not the quick, desperate banging of a man putting up a shack before the cold. Something steadier than that. Something that did not seem to be in any hurry at all, which, in a country where everybody was always in a hurry and always behind anyway, struck us as the strangest thing about him before we'd even seen what he was making. When we did see it, we could not make sense of it. He was building a house out of metal, not a roof of tin, which any of us would have understood. Half the valley had a tin roof patched over with whatever came to hand. No, walls of iron. He had hauled in stove plate, wagon tires, busted plows, the boiler off some dead mine engine, sheet steel that he straightened by hand over a stone, and rail iron that he must have gathered along the old spur line a piece at a time over months, because nobody ever saw him buy any. He set it all on a foundation of dry stacked rock he'd cut himself, and he raised these walls slow, lapping the plates like a man shingling, and between every layer he packed something dark that we couldn't name from a distance. It looked, I will be plain, like a thing a child builds out of a junk pile, except it did not fall down. It was low and humped and gray, set back into the north rocks like it was hiding from us, with one squat chimney and small deep windows, and it caught the afternoon sun and threw it back so hard that on bright days you couldn't look straight at the place. The Dutchman started calling it the stove. Somebody else called it the iron boil. The children dared each other to throw rocks at it from the road and run, and the rocks went clang and the children ran. And Nate, if he was outside, would just straighten up from his work and watch them go, and then bend back down and keep on. He never chased a child. He never said a word to one of us that I heard of for the better part of that first year. He came into the store for flour and coffee and lamp oil and once a length of stovepipe, and he paid and he left, and Volker would do his smiling and his cheating, and the rest of us would look at the floor or out the window until the door closed, and then we'd talk. You know how a town talks. I knew the shape of it because I'd helped make that shape my whole life. We said he must have killed somebody to be living alone out there. We said he was an army scout once and had gone wrong in the head, which was a thing people said about any Apache who didn't fit the picture they'd already painted. We said the house would fall on him in the first hard wind and serve him right. We said all the small, cruel things that cost a man nothing to say in a warm store, and that I would give a great deal now to take back, though I know that taking back is one thing the Lord does not stock on his shelf. I want to tell you one true thing about that year, though, before I go on, because it is the thing that started turning me, and I have never been able to say for certain why. It was the matter of the bird. We'd had a freeze in the late spring, a mean one, the kind that comes after everything has already started to bud, and so it kills twice, the cold itself, and then the false hope it punishes. The morning after, I rode the north line of my place looking for calves that might have gone down in it, and my line ran close enough to Nate's corner that I could see his door. And I saw him come out of it carrying something cupped in both his hands the way you'd carry water you didn't want to spill. He went to the leeward side of his rock and he crouched there a long time, his back to me, his head down. I thought he was sick. I almost rode on. Something kept me. After a while he stood, and he set the thing down in a hollow of stone where the sun would reach it, and it was a bird, a little gray desert bird, half froze, that he must have found stunned somewhere and warmed back to life inside his own hands inside that strange house. It sat in the sun. He watched it, and when it finally found its wings and went, he did not smile exactly. He just watched the empty place where it had been, and then he turned around to go back inside, and he saw me sitting my horse up on the rise, watching him. I did not know what to do. I lifted my hand just a little, the way you do. He looked at me for what felt like a long time, and then he lifted his hand back, just a little, the same way. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say across that distance, and maybe nothing to say up close either. I rode on and found 2 of my calves alive and 1 dead, and I did not tell anyone in town about the bird, because I knew exactly what they would have made of it, and I found that for the first time in my life I did not want to hear them make it. That was the spring. The summer was hot and hard and ordinary. By the fall, the house was finished, and we had mostly stopped talking about it, the way a town stops talking about anything once it's failed to fall over on schedule. Nate had a small garden going in the flood corner that everybody had sworn would grow nothing. And it grew squash and beans and corn in the lee of his iron walls, because, though none of us troubled to wonder why, those walls held the day's heat into the night and broke the killing wind, and the man understood something about warmth that the rest of us, with our drafty timber and our tin roofs and our fires we fed like hungry children, had never once stopped to think about. We did not know that yet. We were about to learn it the hard way, which is the only way Dry Fork ever learned anything. Because the second winter is the one I am really telling you about. The second winter is when the snow came. I have lived through bad winters. Anybody who stays in that country long enough banks a store of them, and you bring them out and compare them on cold nights the way other men compare scars. The winter of the deep snow, we still call it, those of us left. There is no other name it needs. It started the way I told you. Wind at 3, screaming by dark, and behind the wind the snow, not falling so much as being thrown, sideways in sheets, so thick that I lost sight of my own barn from my own porch, and had to go to it on a rope I'd strung that fall for no reason I could have named at the time, except that something in me had been uneasy since the leaves turned. I got my stock into the barn, and I got myself into the house, and I built the fire up, and I thought, the way a fool thinks, I am ready for this. I was not ready for this. No one in that valley was ready for this, because this was not a storm. A storm ends. This sat down on top of us like a thing with weight and intention, and it did not get up for 9 days. The first night the cold was a fierce dry knife. By the third night it had gone into something I have no good word for, a cold that did not feel like temperature anymore, but like the absence of God. A cold that came up through the floorboards and the walls and the seams of the windows, and stood in the middle of my front room like a guest I could not put out. I fed the fire, and the fire ate everything I gave it and gave back almost nothing, because the wind found every crack in my good timber house and pulled the heat straight out through it as fast as I could make it. I burned the firewood. Then I burned the porch rail. Then I burned the kitchen chairs, one at a time, and I sat on the floor in front of the stove wrapped in every blanket and hide I owned with my back to the cold, and counted nails out of the coffee tin until my fingers wouldn't bend. And I will tell you plainly, somewhere in the black middle of the fourth night, I understood that I was going to die in that house I had built with my own hands and been so proud of. I thought of my wife. I thought, if there is anything after, then she is warm now, and I will be too directly, and that is the closest I had come to peace with dying. And then I heard the dog. Not my dog. I'd lost mine 2 years before and never had the heart for another. This was a strange dog, scratching and crying at my door, and when I dragged myself up and broke the ice off the latch and got it open against the wind, there was a dog I half knew, a yellow ranch mongrel that belonged to the Prout family, who lived a mile and a half north of me, closer to the rocks. It was the Prout's dog, and it was nearly gone, and tied to its collar with a strip of hide was a piece of stove plate, and scratched into the soot on the stove plate with a nail was an arrow, just an arrow, pointing north. I have thought about that dog every day of my life since. A man, and there was only one man it could have been, had, in the killing middle of the worst night any of us had ever seen, gone out into it and found a dog, and tied a message to it that did not use a single word because he did not know if the people he was sending it to could read, and sent it south down the line of houses with nothing on it but a direction. Come north. Come to me. He could not know if the dog would live to carry it. He could not know if any door it scratched that would open. He sent it anyway, into the dark, on the chance. I did not understand all of that standing in my doorway. I want to be clear about what I understood and when, because I have spent the rest of my years trying to be honest about the slowness of my own heart. Standing there, I understood only this, that there was an arrow pointing north, and that north was the iron house, and that the man who lived in it was telling me that I should be in it. And I was dying, and I did not have anything left to lose, and so I made the decision that I have never once regretted, and that I am not sure, even now, I deserve the credit for, because it was made for me by cold and by fear and by a half-dead dog more than by any goodness in me. I went north. I will not pretend I remember the going clear. It is a white roar in my memory with my own breath sawing in the middle of it. I tied myself to the dog and the dog to the last of my rope, and I went out into a dark that had no up nor down in it, following an animal that knew the way home better than I knew anything, falling, getting up, falling, the cold so total now that it had stopped hurting, which I knew enough to know was the worst sign of all. I do not know how long. long enough that I had stopped thinking in words. And then there was a wall, a hard, flat wall under my hands where there should have been only snow, and the wall was, I felt it before my mind would say it, the wall was warm. Warm, in the middle of that. A wall you could lay your frozen face against and feel the life come back into your skin. I crawled along it with both hands flat against it like a blind man reading, and I came to a door, and the door opened before I could find the strength to knock, and there was yellow light, and there was heat rolling out of it like the breath of something alive, and there was Nate, and behind him, crowded into that one low, strange iron room that the whole valley had laughed at, there were people. The Prutes, all 5 of them. Old Mrs. Calder from the church corner. 2 of the Vega boys with their faces still gray. Volker the Dutchman, who had named the place the stove to mock it, sitting on the floor against the warm iron wall with his eyes shut and his mouth moving in what I am fairly sure was prayer. More were coming. I was not the last. The dog had been to other doors before mine, and other men had read the arrow, and across the worst night in the history of that country, in 2s and 3s, half frozen, the people who had laughed were crawling toward the one warm light for miles, and the man we had laughed at was standing in his doorway holding it open. He looked at me. I think he knew me as the man on the horse from the spring, the man who had lifted his hand. I will never know for certain, because what passed over his face was not recognition exactly, and it was not warmth, and it was not anything I had a name for. It was something tired and very old and very steady, the look of a man doing a thing he had decided to do a long time ago and was simply now doing. He reached out and he took hold of my coat, and he pulled me in out of the dark. And the door shut behind me, and the wind went on screaming on the other side of the warm iron wall, where it could not reach me any more. A man does not know what warm is until he has been all the way out of it. I have tried in the years since to tell young people what it was to come in from that dark and feel the heat of Nate's house take hold of me, and I have never once managed it. The words go thin in my mouth. The closest I can come is this, that it did not feel like getting warm. It felt like being forgiven, like something I had given up on had decided, against all sense, to take me back. I lay on the packed earth floor where he set me down, near but not too near the squat black stove in the middle of the room, and the feeling came back into my hands the way feeling comes back, which is to say it hurt worse than the numbness had, and I lay there and wept like a child and was not ashamed, because half the room was doing the same and the other half had already done it and gotten quiet. I did not count anything for a long time. That is how I knew how far gone I'd been. My hand did not even go looking for the tin. When my eyes cleared enough to use, I used them because that is the other thing I do. I look and I tally and I cannot help it. I counted the room. 14 souls, not including Nate and not including me. 15 with me. The Prutes, the 5 of them, the children asleep in a heap like pups. Mrs. Calder, 80 if she was a day, sitting upright with her hands folded as though she were in church and meant to stay through the long sermon. The 2 Vega boys. The Dutchman. A hand named Pell who worked the Ostergaard place, and a girl I didn't know who turned out to be the Ostergaard's niece. Both of them young and both of them shaking still. A widower named Briggs and his grown son. And in the corner farthest from the door, 2 old people I did not know at all, who I learned later had been walking the road from the eastern claims when the dog found them, and would have been dead in an hour. 15 of us. In a one-room house that the whole valley had said would not hold a man and a stove without falling down. And it was warm, not just out of the wind warm, warm enough that the children had thrown off the blankets they'd come in under, warm enough that the ice in old Mrs. Calder's gray hair had melted and run down, and she'd wiped it away with a cloth like it was a summer sweat. I lay there and I could not understand it, and being a man who cannot abide not understanding a thing, I started, even then, even half dead, to look at how it was made. The walls were the iron we'd all laughed at, but the iron I saw now was only the skin. Between the lapped plates and the inside of the room he had built a second wall, of mud, brick, and stone, near a foot thick, And between that wall and the iron he'd packed the dark stuff we'd never been able to name from the road, which was ash, I think. Ash and earth and dry dung and broken charcoal, packed tight. The worst conductor of cold a man could ask for, and free for the gathering if a man had the patience. And Nate plainly had patience the way other men had debts. The iron caught the day's sun, and the sun's heat went into the mass, and the mass held it and gave it back slow through the night. And the wind, that thief, that murderer, the wind could pull and pull at the iron skin all it liked and never reach the warmth behind it. The small deep windows faced south to drink the light and were shuttered now with fitted iron plates against the dark. The low roof was the same, iron over earth over more iron, humped so the snow slid and could not pile and crush. And in the middle of it all, the stove. But not a stove like mine, that ate wood like a starving thing and threw its heat straight up the pipe and out into the night for the cold to have. His stove was set in a mass of stone and brick, a great low square of it, and the pipe did not go straight up. It ran sideways first, a long crooked way through the stone bench that ran along one wall, so that the heat of the fire had to crawl the whole length of that stone before it could escape, and gave nearly all of itself to the stone on the way. The old people sat on that bench. Mrs. Calder sat on that bench. It was warm as a sleeping body, and it stayed warm for hours on a single small fire. And Nate fed that fire not with logs but with sticks, with dry brush, with cakes of pressed dung and a little coal, careful, a handful at a time. The way you'd feed a fire you meant to keep alive for 9 days and not 1 hour longer. I lay on his floor and I looked at all of it, and a thing came open in me that has never closed since. We had laughed at him. We had thrown rocks at his house and called it the stove to mock him, and the truth, the whole stupid bitter truth of it, was that he had built the only sane house in the valley, and we had all built tinderboxes and called him the fool. He had thought about cold the way a man thinks about an enemy he has met before. He had built a house that an enemy could not get into. And when the enemy came, the same people who had laughed had come crawling to the one door in 11 miles that the cold could not open, and he had pulled us in, every one, and asked nothing, and said nothing, and gone back to feeding his small, careful fire. I will tell you that not everybody took it the way I did. The Dutchman could not look at the man. I watched it the second day, when the worst of the dying fear had passed off us and we'd begun, the way people do, to be ordinary again, to be small again. Volker had got his color back, and with his color came his pride, and his pride could not abide where it found itself. He sat against the warm wall, and he ate the cornmeal mush that Nate cooked in an iron pot, and handed round in whatever the man had, bowls, cups, a hubcap scoured clean, his own 2 cupped hands for the littlest brute who had nothing else, and Volker ate it. And you could see it going down him like a stone, because every spoonful was a thing he owed now to a man he had spent 2 years making the valley laugh at. There is a particular meanness that comes up in a certain kind of man when he has been shamed by his own rescue. It came up in Volker. Late on the second day, when a child cried and Nate went to the stove to ease the fire and the light caught his face, Volker said low to Briggs beside him, "I'd watch the food. You don't know what these people'll do once we're beholden." He did not say it quietly enough, or maybe he meant not to. Mrs. Calder, who had been a schoolteacher for 40 years before she was anything else, turned her head and looked at the Dutchman the way she must have looked at 1,000 boys caught lying, and she said, "And I have never forgotten it, Mr. Volker. That man has fed you twice today out of his own hand. If your gratitude is going to be that small, have the decency to keep it where I can't smell it." The room went quiet. The Dutchman's face went through about 4 colors, and Nate gave no sign he'd heard any of it. He fed the fire. He set the lid back on the pot. He went and crouched by the 2 strangers from the eastern road, the walking old couple, and felt the man's hands and the woman's feet for the gray hard places where the frost takes hold, and rubbed them slow, the same patient way he'd rubbed life back into that little spring bird, and never once looked at the Dutchman at all. That was a kind of answer, the best kind, the kind that doesn't lower itself. I learned his story in pieces, and I will give it to you the way I got it, in pieces, because I think a man's grief is owed that much, not to be laid out neat for strangers. The first piece was the bench, the long stone bench that held the heat. There was a place worn into it, smooth, the size of where a small body might sit, near the warmest end, and there was nothing built there, no reason for it, and I saw him, the second night when he thought the room was sleeping, put his hand flat on that worn place and leave it there a while. Just leave it there. The way you'd touch a stone you'd set over someone. The second piece was the child. The littlest Prute, the girl, 3 years old maybe, woke in the black of the third night frightened and crying for her mother, who was dead asleep with exhaustion and didn't stir. And Nate, who was awake, he was always awake. I think he did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch that whole 9 days, because the fire could not be let to die. Nate went to her, and he picked her up, and he carried her to the warm end of the bench and sat with her against his chest, and he sang to her, low, in a language none of us knew. And the child stopped crying and went asleep against him, and he sat there holding her, this man we'd called a killer, and over the top of her head his face was a thing I could not bear to look at directly, the way you cannot look at the sun off the iron on a bright day, and I understood, the way you understand a thing in your gut before your mind will say it, that he had done this before, that his arms knew this, that somewhere sometime there had been a child the right size for those arms, and there was not any more, and that was why he had built a house that the cold could never get into, too late, years too late, for whoever it was the cold had already taken. I never asked him. You do not ask a man that. But Mrs. Calder, who in 40 years of teaching had learned how to be told things, sat with him on the 5th day while the storm took one of its short breaths, and she came back to her place by me with her eyes wet, and all she would say was, he had a wife and a daughter. There was a winter on the road when they were being moved. You know how they were moved, Eli. We all know how it was done, and the wife and the girl did not live through the cold of it, and the soldiers would not stop, and he was made to keep walking. And then she would say no more, and folded her hands and looked at the fire, and I counted nails in my pocket where no one could see, 11, 12, 13, because there was nothing else in the world to do with what she had told me. He had walked away from his own family frozen in the snow because men with guns made him. And then he had spent who knows how many years and how many miles gathering rail iron a piece at a time, and stove plate, and busted plows, and he had carried it all to a worthless corner of a valley full of people who hated him. And he had built, out of the very cold-hearted metal of the country that had taken everything from him, a house that the cold could not kill anybody in, ever again. He had turned his whole grief into a warm room, and then he had sent a dog out into the storm to fill it with the children of the people who threw rocks at his walls. I have known some good men. I count myself on my good days near the edge of the company. I never knew another like that. I do not expect to. The hard thing came on the 6th day, and it came, the way hard things do, out of pride that wasn't even in the room. It was the Vega boys. They'd been quiet from the start, quieter than frightened boys ought to be, sitting close together and flinching whenever the door so much as rattled, and on the 6th morning the older one, Marco, broke. He'd been holding it 6 days and it broke all at once, and he was crying and trying not to, 15 years old and trying to be a man about a thing no man could be about, and the truth came out of him in pieces between his teeth. Their father had not come. Their little sister had not come. The dog had been to the Vega place, they'd seen it, seen the arrow on the plate, their father had read it. And their father, Tomas Vega, a proud, hard man who'd had his own opinions of Nate shouted across more than one saloon, had looked at that arrow pointing north to the Apache's house, and he had said he would not. He would not crawl to that man's door. He would not put his family under that man's roof and owe that man their lives. He'd sent the 2 boys, because the boys were near grown and he could not stop them. But he had kept the baby with him, little Rosa, 4 years old, and he had kept himself. And he had said the Vegas would ride it out in their own house like Christians. And the boys had argued and lost and gone, because What does a boy do? And that was 6 days ago, and their house was a tinderbox like all our houses. And a man and a 4-year-old child had been alone in it through 6 days of a cold that had nearly killed grown men inside the rope length of their own barns. The room understood all at once what it meant. You could feel it go through us. 6 days in a house like ours with a child. And then everyone understood the second thing, which was worse, and nobody said it. And I will say it now because I am old and there is no profit any more in being kind to the truth. Every one of us, in that first silent minute, hoped somebody else would do something about it, and counted the cost of the storm still blowing outside, and was glad in the lowest part of ourselves that the Vegas were not our own. Nate stood up. He had been crouched at the fire and he stood up, and he looked at the boys, and he asked, the first whole sentence I ever heard him speak to any of us, in plain enough English, quiet, which way is your house? And the room came apart. Because they all knew the way I knew what they were watching. The man at the fire was the reason 15 people were alive. He was the one who knew the careful feeding of it, the long crooked pipe, the hoarding of the fuel, the rubbing of frozen feet. If he walked out that door into a storm that had nearly killed every one of us within shouting distance of safety, to go a mile and more across open ground to a house that might already hold nothing but 2 frozen bodies, if he walked out and did not walk back, then he took our lives out the door with him, all 15, on the chance of saving 2 who had chosen not to be saved. Volker said it. Of course it was Volker. He was on his feet too now and his voice was high and fast. You can't go, you'll die and we'll all die. The man wouldn't even come. He made his choice. He made his bed and there was more of it, and the ugly thing about it was that it was not wrong. That is the part I have never been able to set down easy. The Dutchman, the meanest soul in the room, was not wrong. The arithmetic was on his side. 15 against 2, and the keeper of the fire against a man too proud to be kept. I want to tell you that I stood up clean and noble against him. I did not. I sat there with the arithmetic going around in my own head, 15 and 2, 15 and 2, and I could not make it come out any way but Volker's, and I hated him for being right, and I hated myself worse for doing his sums. Nate let the Dutchman talk himself out. He had a way of doing that. When the room was quiet again, he did not argue the arithmetic. He did not say a word about it. He went to the wall and took down his coat, the heavy hide coat he'd hung there dripping 6 days before, and he pulled it on, and he wound a strip of wool around his face, and the only thing he said to the room, to all of us, in that flat, patient voice, was this: "A man does not get to decide who is worth the cold." And he looked at me when he said it. I will swear to my grave he looked at me, the man on the horse, the man who lifted his hand in the spring. And something in me, that the arithmetic had nearly killed, got up off the floor. I do not fully know why I went with him. I have turned it over for a great many years and I cannot find the bottom of it. It was not courage, or not only. Some of it was shame, plain shame at the sums I'd been doing. Some of it was that I could not stand to watch him walk out alone and live after, with the knowing that I'd watched. And some of it, the truest part maybe, the part I am least proud of and most glad of, was that I simply did not want him to be out there by himself. That a man who had once been made to walk away from his own dead in the snow should not, this time, walk into the snow alone. That if it was going to take him, it would have to take the both of us, and at least he'd have a hand to lift to at the end of it. I got up. My knees did not want to. I went to the wall and I took my own coat down beside his, and the room watched me do it, and the Dutchman started in again, and Mrs. Calder told him to hush in a voice that closed the matter. Nate looked at me, just looked, and then he did a thing he had not done. He put his hand on my shoulder once and gripped it hard and let go. We took the spent dog, because it knew the way and was the only thing that did, and we took rope, and Nate took a coal in an iron box wrapped in hide against his chest, a single live coal, to start a fire at the other end if there was anything left at the other end to warm. He banked his stove careful and told Marco Vega, the older boy, exactly how to feed it, sticks not logs, a handful at the time, and made him say it back twice. And then he opened the door of the only warm place for miles, and the cold came in like it had been waiting, and the two of us went out into it, and the door shut behind us. The last thing I heard from inside, under the scream of the wind, was the little Prout girl who had taken to him, beginning to cry. There is a kind of cold that stops being weather and starts being a country of its own, and we walked out into it. I cannot give you the crossing whole. The mind will not keep a thing like that whole. It keeps it the way it keeps a fever, in jagged pieces with darkness between them. I remember the rope between us going tight and slack, Nate ahead and the dog ahead of him and me at the tail of it like the last knot in a fraying line. I remember that there was no ground and no sky, only the white roar, and that within 50 steps the warm door behind us might as well have never been built, because the cold did not believe in it, and neither, for long stretches, did I remember falling and the snow being almost soft, almost kind, almost a bed, and how that softness was the murderer's first sweet word. And how Nate came back down the rope each time, and got his hands under my arms, and hauled me up before I could lie down and listen to it. He did that for me. A man going to spend himself completely before the night was out, and he spent some of it, more than once, hauling a fool rancher up out of the snow who had no business out there but his own late-come shame. The dog knew the Vega place. That is the only reason there is a story to tell, and not just 2 more shapes the spring thaw gave back to the valley in April. The dog found the wall of the Vega barn, and then the corner of the house, and Nate found the door, and the door was drifted half over and would not give, and the 2 of us put what we had left against it, and it broke inward, and we fell into the dark of that house out of the dark of that storm, and it was cold inside. That is the thing I knew in the first half-second, lying on the floor of Tomás Vega's house with the wind howling in through the door we'd broken. It was cold inside, as cold near as out. There was no fire. There had been no fire for a long time. Nate got the door shut behind us. He got the iron box open against his chest, and the coal in it was still live. He'd kept it live the whole crossing with his own warmth, and I have thought since that this was the truest measure of the man, that he would carry fire across the end of the world inside his coat against his own heart on the chance there'd be someone left to give it to. He found dry tinder in the cold stove, and he breathed the coal into it, slow, patient, the way he did everything, and a small light came up in that dead house. And by that small light we found them. Tomás Vega had not been a fool. I want that set down. Whatever else the man was, whatever pride had walked him into the grave, he had not been a fool, and he had not stopped fighting until there was nothing left in him to fight with. He had done everything a man in a tinderbox could do. He had pulled the family into the smallest room and stuffed the door and the window with everything soft in the house. He had burned the furniture. We could see the marks of it in the cold stove, the chair rungs, the table legs, burned down to nothing days ago. He had burned the doors off their hinges. When the wood was gone he had burned, I think, the books, because there was a Bible-shaped char in the ashes and the corner of a clasp. He had done all of it, and it had not been enough, because the house could not hold the heat any better than a basket holds water, and the cold had come in through the walls faster than one man could feed a fire against it, the same way it had come into my house, the same way it had nearly killed us all in our good proud timber boxes. While one man in an iron house we'd laughed at fed sticks to a careful fire and kept 15 souls alive. We found him in the corner of that small room. He had run out of things to burn, and so at the end he had done the only thing he had left to do. He had taken off his own coat and his own shirt, and he had wrapped the child in them, and then he had wrapped the child in himself, his bare arms and his bare chest around her, his back to the cold wall, giving her the last warmth in his own body, the only way a body can give it, which is by spending itself down to nothing. He had made of his own self the last wall between his daughter and the cold. And it had worked. That is the thing. That is the unbearable, holy, terrible thing. It had worked. Tomás Vega was dead, had been dead some hours, gone gray and stiff in the corner of his cold house. But inside the cocoon of his arms and his coat and his shirt and his cooling then cold body, little Rosa Vega, 4 years old, was alive, weak, far gone, but breathing. Her father had spent his last warmth like a man pouring out the last of the water for a child in a desert, knowing there was none coming, and he had bought her 6 hours, 8, however long it had been, bought her exactly enough to still be breathing when the door broke in. Nate knelt by them a long time before he touched anything. I have wondered ever since what was going through him in that minute, the man who had been made to leave his own child cold in the snow, kneeling now in front of a man who had died, turning himself into a wall against that very thing. I think, but I am only guessing at a country I was never let into, I think he was looking at the thing he had not been allowed to do, the death he had not been allowed to die. Some men, when they finally meet the thing that has haunted them, fall apart. Nate did not fall apart. He reached out, and with great care, with a gentleness I do not have the words to carry to you, he worked the child loose from her father's frozen arms, and he held her against the warmth of his own chest where the coal had been, and he closed Tomás Vega's eyes with his thumb, the eyes of the man who would not come to his door. He closed them the way you'd close them for your own brother. Then he wrapped Rosa in his own coat, and he held her by the small new fire, and he did not say anything, and neither did I, because there was nothing in the language of either of us that was the right size for that room. The storm kept us 2 more days in that house of the dead. We could not have carried the child back across the open ground while it still blew. We'd have spent her father's gift for nothing. So we stayed, and Nate fed the careful fire he'd kindled from his carried coal, and slowly, slowly, the small room warmed enough to keep us, though never enough to be called warm. He worked over the child the whole time, warmed her by degrees, never too fast, which I did not understand then and understand now, because warming a frozen body too quick can kill it as sure as the cold. He got broth into her, melted snow, and a little of the cornmeal he'd thought to bring. On the 2nd day she woke enough to ask for her father, and Nate told her, I heard him, in that low, flat voice, that her father had kept her warm and was sleeping now, and that they were going to go somewhere warm, and the child believed him because children believe the voice more than the words, and his voice was a thing you could lean your whole weight on. We covered Tomás. We could not bury him. The ground was iron itself. We laid him straight and covered him, and Nate stood over him a moment with his head down, the same posture I'd seen the morning of the bird, 3 winters and a lifetime ago. I do not know what he said over him, if he said anything. It was not for me. I sat in the corner those 2 days, and I did the thing I do, because a man holds to his small habits when the large world has come apart. I went through my pockets, and I found, of all things, 4 nails I'd carried out of my own dying house without knowing it, and I counted them, 1, 2, 3, 4, over and over, while a man I had laughed at sang low to a child whose father had turned to ice around her. And somewhere in those 2 days the laughing man I had been died as surely as Tomás Vega did. And I do not miss him. I have not missed him once. On the 3rd morning the wind stopped. I want you to understand what that is after 9 days. It is not quiet. It is louder than the wind was. The silence comes down and rings in your ears like a struck bell, and you cannot at first believe it. And you go to the broken door and you push it open, and the world is white and blinding and utterly still, and the sun is on it, hard and cold and merciless and the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. And you understand that you are going to live, and the understanding is almost more than the body can hold. We made ready to cross back. It was better going now, over crusted snow under a hard sky, but it was bitter still, a dry deep cold that the sun did nothing to warm, and we had a child to carry, and Nate would carry her. He wrapped her in his coat, the heavy hide coat, the warmest thing either of us had, and he bound her to his chest, and that left him in his shirt only, and I said something about it. I said he'd freeze, take mine, and he looked at me and said, she does not get to be cold again, and that was the end of it. He would not hear another word. So we crossed. The dog ahead spent near to dying itself but game, and Nate behind it with the child bound warm against him in the only coat, and me behind him, and Nate's hands. I watched it happen and could do nothing, Nate's bare hands working the rope and steadying the child and pushing up out of the drifts. His bare hands in that dry killing cold the whole long mile and more of it. Because his coat was around the child and his arms were around the coat, and there was nothing left over for his hands. I gave him my gloves at the halfway. He took them. He could not feel to put them on by then. I put them on him myself, over hands that had already gone past white into the gray that does not come back, and we both knew it, and neither of us said it, and we kept walking, because the only thing in the world to do was keep walking and get the child to the warm. We saw the house from a quarter-mile. The iron of it caught the new sun and threw it back so hard it hurt to look at, that same blinding glare we had all mocked, and there was smoke from the chimney, a thin good line of it standing straight up in the still air, which meant the boy had kept the fire, which meant they were alive in there, all of them, and Nate saw the smoke and I heard him make a sound, just one, that I had not heard him make before, and then the door of the iron house opened and they were coming out, all of them, wadding out into the snow toward us, the Proots and the Vega boys running ahead of everyone, running toward the small bound shape of their sister against the chest of the man their father would not go to. And the man carried her the last of the way and put her down into her brother's arms, alive, alive. And then Nate sat down in the snow as if his legs had simply been switched off, and did not get up. We saved his life. We could not save his hands. There was a doctor finally, a week later when the passes opened, brought up from the county seat through snow still chest-deep in the draws, and he did what doctors did in those days, which was not much and was terrible, and Nate bore it the way he bore everything, with a flat patient silence that the doctor found unnerving and I found I understood completely. He kept the hands mostly. But they were never hands again, not the hands that had straightened steel over a stone and lapped iron plate like shingles, and carried a live coal across the end of the world, and warmed a frozen bird back into the sky. They were claws he could barely close, scarred and clumsy, and forever cold to the touch. The cruelest joke the cruel country ever played, that the man who had defeated the cold for everyone else should carry it in his own 2 hands to the end of his days. He never once said a word against it. I said the words for him, in my heart, for years, and they did me no good, and I expect they did him none either. The valley changed. I will not lie and say it changed all at once or changed all the way, because that is the kind of neat ending that people who were not there like to put on a thing, and I was there, and it was not neat. Some did not change. There are people who would rather hate a man than owe him, and they went on the rest of their lives finding small reasons, and I will not name them here though I could. But most of us changed, in the slow shamed way that hard people change, which is to say, without ever quite saying so out loud. The children who had thrown rocks at his walls came back in the spring, and they did not throw rocks. They came shy in 2s and 3s, with things their mothers had sent, bread, a jar of something, a chair to replace the ones we'd all burned, and they left them by his door and ran, the same as before, except this time they were running from being thanked, not from being caught. The men came too, eventually, and the thing about men is they cannot just come, they have to come with a reason, so they came to help. His hands could not build any more, and there was always building to do up there at the flood corner, and so the men of Dry Fork who had laughed at the stove spent a good part of 3 summers up there with their own hands, raising things to Nate's drawings, because he could still draw after a fashion, holding the charcoal in both ruined fists, and what they raised over those summers was more iron houses, smaller ones, his design. Because every soul in that valley had felt the cold come up through their own good timber floors and stand in the middle of their own front rooms like death, and not one of us ever wanted to feel it again, and the man we had called a fool turned out to be the only one who'd known how to keep it out. By the 3rd winter there were 9 of them up and down the valley, low gray humped houses that caught the sun and held it, that the children of Dry Fork would grow up in and be warm in and never know to be grateful for, the way you are never grateful for the thing that was simply always true. And in the middle winters, the bad ones, the cold ones, people came to his. They always came to his. It had room, and it had the great stone bench warm as a sleeping body, and it had him. And on the deep cold nights you would find half the valley in it, the children asleep in a heap on the warm floor and the old ones on the bench, and the talk going low and easy. And it was, just as the old saying about the place had turned itself inside out to become, the warmest place for miles. They came to be warm. I think, though no one ever said it, they came to be near the warmth that was in him, which was a different thing and a rarer one, and did not run out the way fire does. He raised Rosa Vega. Did I say that? Her brothers were near grown and went to work, and the girl had no mother, and it fell out, the way these things fall out without anybody quite deciding them, that the child stayed up at the iron house more than she stayed anywhere, and Nate, who had once been made to walk away from a daughter in the snow, raised another man's daughter to a woman in the house he'd built against the cold. She used to sit at the warm end of the bench, at the worn place. I do not think she ever knew why it was worn, or that it had been worn by a hand before hers, leaving the shape of another small body she would never hear about. I never told her. It was not mine to tell. I am near the end of my ledger now, and the end of his. He died in the summer, which I have always been grateful for, that the cold did not get him after all, that he went out warm and in the green of the year with the door open and the good dry wind coming up the wash. Rosa was with him. I was not. I came after, and the house was full of the valley the way it always was, and quiet, and somebody had put fresh brush in the careful stove, though it was July and needed no fire, just so the place would not be cold, and I understood that. I understood it down to my boots. I went to the bench, to the worn place. I put my hand flat on it the way I had once watched him do, the second night of the storm, when he thought the room was sleeping. It was warm. From the small, needless summer fire, it was warm, the way he had built it to be, the way it would go on being long after the both of us, holding the day's heat into the dark and giving it back slow to whoever came in cold. I sat down there, an old man with a coffee tin of bent nails in his coat that he no longer needed to count, and I thought about the morning of the bird and the little gray thing finding its wings and the man watching the empty place where it had been. And I lifted my hand, just a little, the way you do. There was no one there to lift one back.